My family has a secret, one we've carried in the soil and shadows of this land since 1965. It breathes in the fog that rolls off the Olympic Peninsula, and it walks in the deep woods where the light barely touches the ground. Bigfoot isn't a myth. He's been our silent neighbor. And I'm breaking my father's one and only rule by telling you this, because last week my 80-year-old daughter, Lily, finally saw why it watches us. This isn't a campfire story. It's a confession. And by the end of it, you'll understand that the real monsters aren't the ones hiding in the trees. The weight of this story is heavy, and I have to put it down. I have to, before it crushes me completely. I'm asking you to listen, to just hear me out, to bear witness to what I've seen and what I now have to do. You need to know I'm not some crank. My credibility is etched in the calluses on my hands and in the daily logbook I keep for the Department of Natural Resources. I manage 200 acres of sustainable timber forest, a legacy from my grandfather. It's a job of hard lines and physical proof. I can tell a Douglas fir from a western hemlock just by the sound the wind makes rustling through its needles. I can gauge the moisture content of the soil with my bare hands. My world is one of tangible things, of measurements and consequences. Each day is a cycle of assessing, felling, and planting. There is a precise logic to the forest, a system of cause and effect that I have staked my life and my reputation on. This land is not a mystery to me. I know its rhythms, its scents, its seasons, or at least I thought I did. The air here has a weight, especially in the mornings. It's a damp, earthy scent of moss and decay that seems to coat the back of your throat. The silence isn't empty. It's a thick blanket of sound, if you know how to listen. The constant, soft drip of water from fern leaves onto the forest floor. The distant, lonely call of a raven echoing across the valley. The low, arthritic groan of an ancient cedar shifting its weight in the wind. These are the sounds of my home. They are the baseline, the constant hum beneath my life. It's a quiet that has always felt like a comfort, like a presence in itself. But you learn, living out here, that there are different kinds of quiet, and some of them are warnings. My father died 6 months ago. The grief is a constant, cold presence, just like the fog that rolls in from the Strait of Juan de Fuca, obscuring everything you thought you knew. He left me this land, the logbook, and the burden of its oldest secret. He was a man of few words. My father. He believed some things were felt rather than said. But he said this enough that it burned into my memory. A phrase he would use when I asked too many questions about the sounds at the edge of the property, or the strange shadows I'd glimpse as a boy. He'd just put a hand on my shoulder, look toward the tree line, and say, "It watches." That was all. Not in a threatening way, but in a factual one. Like stating that the sun rises in the east, it watches. Last Tuesday, that burden shifted from a memory to a living, breathing reality. I was working the South Ridge, marking a stand of hemlock for thinning next spring. The air was still, the sky a clean, sharp blue. And then the woods went dead quiet. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was a specific, unnatural hush that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Every bird went silent. The squirrels stopped their chattering. Even the wind, it seemed, held its breath. It's the kind of silence that precedes a predator. A cougar on the hunt. A bear emerging from the brush. It's the sound of everything hiding at once. And it meant something was moving. Something big. My blood ran cold. Then I heard it. Not a roar, not a scream like you hear in those fake videos. It was a low, resonant thump asterisk that I felt more than heard. A vibration that traveled from the damp earth, through the soles of my boots, and straight into my bones. It's a sound my father had taught me to recognize. A sound I hadn't heard in years. It's not aggression. It's a warning, a signal. And it was closer than it had ever been before. It was a territorial sound, a communication meant for me and me alone. It was the sound of an alarm being raised. I dropped my tools and I ran. I didn't even think. I just sprinted, the branches whipping at my face, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs that matched the thumping from the woods. My only thought was Lily. Where was Lily? She was supposed to be playing on the porch, within sight of the cabin. But as I burst through the tree line, my lungs burning, the cabin was quiet. Too quiet. My gaze swept the yard, the porch, the woodpile. And then I saw her. She was standing at the very edge of the woods, right by the old stone wall that marks the boundary of our yard. Just standing there, perfectly still. She was pale, trembling. Her eyes wide and fixed on the tree line, where nothing stood but deepening shadows. I called her name, and she flinched, turning to me as if waking from a trance. I ran to her, scooped her up, and she just buried her face in my neck. I kept asking her what was wrong, what she saw. She wouldn't speak. She just pointed a shaky finger back toward the dark wall of trees. It was only later, after I got her inside with a warm cup of milk, that she finally told me. She said she'd heard someone call her name, not in a voice she knew. She said it sounded like rocks grinding together, deep in the earth. That night, I sat in the dark long after she was asleep, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I made a choice. I went into her room and watched her breathe, watched the peaceful innocence on her face, and I knew I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't place this impossible burden on her small shoulders. It was my inheritance, not hers, but I also couldn't ignore the warning, the call, the fact that the boundary had been crossed, in a way. He had communicated with her, and I didn't know why. My father's words echoed in my head. It watches, but why was it suddenly speaking? The next morning, I walked her to the old stone wall. I didn't tell her about a monster. I didn't tell her about a legend. I just reminded her of the oldest family rule, the one my grandfather taught my father, and my father taught me. I looked her in the eyes, and I made her promise me, "You never ever go past the old stone wall alone." I made it sound like it was about bears or getting lost, a normal fatherly concern. But she and I both knew it was about something else. She just nodded, her eyes still holding a shadow of what she'd seen. The woods have rules, and one of them had just been broken. I'm telling you all this as a foundation, because what happened next? What began as a ritual of respect my grandfather started in 1965 has now become something else entirely. It's a negotiation. A desperate attempt to understand a message I can no longer ignore. If you're still with me, if you feel that knot in your stomach that I'm feeling right now, then please, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this with someone you trust. You need to stay until the end of this story, because you need to hear about the pact. You need to understand the rules of the exchange, and what happens when you break them, because I'm afraid I already have. This pact, this understanding, it didn't start with me. It began with my grandfather, back in the winter of '65, that year. The snow was relentless, piling up in drifts that buried fences and swallowed roads. He was out checking his property lines after a particularly brutal storm when he found them. Massive, deep tracks in the snow, leading toward the old fencing wire that separates the lower pasture. There, tangled and half-dead from exhaustion and cold, was a doe. It was a heart-wrenching sight, the animal's eyes wide, with a terror that had long since given way to a dull resignation. My grandfather, a man who believed you owed a debt to the land you lived on, didn't hesitate. He spent the better part of an hour in the freezing cold, carefully snipping the wire with his cutters, calming the animal with a low voice until it was finally free. It stumbled, then vanished back into the woods. He thought nothing more of it, just an act of basic decency. An obligation met. That's the first rule of this place, older than any other. You give back more than you take. The next morning, he went back to finish the fencing job. He'd left his heavy work gloves on a colossal, petrified tree stump at the edge of the clearing. A landmark so old, it felt like a part of the geology of the place. But his gloves weren't there. In their place, sitting dead center on the flat gray surface of the stump, was a single perfect quartz crystal. It was milky white, the size of a goose egg, and smooth as a river stone. He picked it up, felt the impossible coldness of it. He knew the geology of this peninsula like the back of his hand, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that this type of quartz was not found anywhere in this region, not for hundreds of miles. The gesture was unmistakable. The act of mercy had been seen, and it had been answered. A payment had been made. It was the first word in a conversation that would span 3 generations, a silent acknowledgement that we were not, and had never been, the only stewards of this forest. The woods had rules, and my grandfather had just learned the most important one. Respect is a currency. That was the start of the ritual. The stump became a sort of altar, a neutral ground. It was never spoken of as such, but the understanding was passed down from my grandfather to my father, and from my father to me. We leave offerings, not junk, not leftovers. It's a gesture of respect, so the offering has to have value to us. Apples from the small orchard behind the cabin, shiny and crisp. In the fall, a handful of walnuts, shelled and clean. Sometimes, when I've had a good day in the workshop, I'll leave one of my hand-carved wooden animals, a bear or an owl. Small things, tokens of our presence and our intent. It's a quiet way of saying, we are here. We see you. We mean no harm. It's a continuation of that first act of kindness, a reaffirming of the treaty my grandfather made without ever speaking a word. The offering is a promise, a renewal of the pact. It's a small price to pay, for peace, for balance. And we always paid it on time, because the silence that followed when we didn't was worse than any noise. The return gifts are never direct. They are a language of symbols, of subtle nudges. You don't get a quartz crystal every time. Most of the time the gifts are practical, almost unnervingly so. After a 2-week dry spell one July, when I was worried about the new saplings, I woke up to find a pile of rare golden chanterelle mushrooms on the main path to the ridge, enough for 3 meals. They were laid out carefully on a bed of moss, fresh, as if picked just minutes before I found them. Another time, my chainsaw chain snapped when I was miles from the cabin. I left the saw, planning a long walk back to get a spare. When I returned the next morning, a brand new, still in the box chain, my preferred brand and size, was sitting on top of it. I have no idea where it came from. There are no neighbors for miles. It's a language of reciprocity, a constant quiet exchange that says, I see what you need. It's intelligent, it understands, and that understanding is both a comfort and a terrifying thing to live with. The most profound example, the one that proved it wasn't just an exchange, but a form of protection, happened about 5 years ago. I was heading up the west slope to clear some brush. It was a calm day, but something felt off. I came to a place where a thick, heavy branch had been deliberately laid across the trail, completely blocking my way. It was too large to have fallen naturally and landed so perfectly. It was placed. I was annoyed, thinking it was a prank by hikers, though I hadn't seen any. I was about to start cutting it apart when I heard that deep, resonant, asterisk, thump thump asterisk from the ridge above me. The warning. I froze. And then, a sound like a cannon shot echoed through the valley. A massive widowmaker branch, a dead limb the size of a small car, crashed down from a cedar tree, landing exactly where I would have been standing if I hadn't been stopped. It would have killed me instantly. The placed branch hadn't been an obstacle. It had been a lifesaver. It watches, and sometimes it intervenes. Over the decades, this exchange has solidified into a set of unspoken but absolute rules. Rules you learn by feel, by consequence. The first is you never approach the clearing of the stump at night. The night belongs to the woods. It is their time, not ours. Approaching it would be like walking into a stranger's house uninvited after dark. It's a violation of territory, a sign of disrespect, or, worse, a challenge. The second rule is you never leave anything but the agreed-upon offerings. No trash, no tools, no trace of anything that doesn't belong. The stump is not a garbage can. It's a point of contact, and it must be kept clean, kept pure. It's a simple rule, but it's about maintaining the sanctity of the pact. These two are easy. They are about deference. It's the third rule that carries all the weight. It's the one that tests your soul. The third rule is the hardest and the most important. You never, ever try to follow it. You don't try to get a picture. You don't try to get a better look. You accept the mystery. You accept the space between you. To follow it is to hunt it. It is to turn a relationship of mutual respect into one of predator and prey, of observer and observed. It's an act of profound betrayal. It says, I don't trust you. I want to possess you, to know you, to expose you. It's the ultimate human arrogance. the need to conquer and define everything we don't understand. This rule is the bedrock of the entire pact. To break it is to declare that you see it not as a neighbor, but as a curiosity, a monster. And my father, in a moment of weakness, once broke that rule. It was a mistake he regretted for the rest of his life. A story he only told me once, his voice low with a shame that was still palpable after 30 years. He was younger then, not much older than I am now. He told me the curiosity just gnawed at him. He'd left an offering of late-season blackberries and was walking away when he heard a rustle in the ferns just beyond the clearing. He knew he shouldn't. He knew the rule. But the temptation, just for a second, to see the face of the thing that had guarded his family his entire life, was too strong. He told me he only took a few steps off the path, peering into the deep green shadows. He didn't see anything, just a flicker of immense, dark movement, gone as quickly as it appeared. He felt a sudden, crushing sense of being watched, not with curiosity, but with a cold, deep disappointment. He turned and walked back to the cabin, the feeling of his transgression like a physical weight on his shoulders. He knew instantly that he had made a terrible mistake. He had broken the trust. The punishment was not an act of aggression. There was no roar, no threat. The punishment was silence. The gifts stopped. For an entire year, the stump remained empty. The forest felt different, accusatory. The comfortable, living quiet I described was replaced by a heavy, lonely quiet. A dead quiet. The birdsong seemed more distant. The trails felt unwelcoming. It was as if a presence had simply been withdrawn, a door closed and locked. My father said it was the longest year of his life. He felt the absence every single day. He continued to leave offerings, week after week. With no reply, they were apologies. It was his penance. He was terrified he had broken the pact for good, that his one selfish act had undone a generation of trust. That fear of the silence returning is a secret I now carry alone. The fear of that profound, isolating emptiness. That fear is what kept him from ever trying again. It's what he tried to instill in me, not through commands, but through his own quiet reverence. When the gifts finally resumed, a single eagle feather left on the stump one morning, after a storm, the relief was so immense, he almost wept. He never spoke of it again, but I saw it in the way he moved through the woods, with a renewed and permanent sense of deference. He understood. Some things aren't for us to know. They aren't for us to see, or to prove. They are simply for us to coexist with. And now he's gone. Now the pact rests entirely on my shoulders. It's no longer a shared family duty. It is a solitary vigil, a burden of one. And after what happened with Lily, the weight of it feels heavier than ever before. The rules suddenly feel fragile, and the silence on the other side feels closer. And so, 3 days after Lily heard her name called from the trees, I knew what I had to do. The warning thump, the call to my daughter Rit, was a change in the pattern. It was a new word in the silent conversation, and it demanded a response. I couldn't just go on with the routine as if nothing had happened. I had to acknowledge it. I had to go to the stump. My hands trembled slightly as I picked out the largest, most perfect apple from our stores, polishing it on my shirt until it shone. This wasn't just an offering, it was a question. It was me holding up my end of the bargain, showing my respect, and asking in the only way I knew how. Asterisk, what do you want? Why now? Why her? Asterisk. The walk to the clearing felt different this time. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every snap of a twig under my boots sounded like a gunshot in the charged air. I could feel it watching me. The feeling was so intense, so palpable. It was like a physical pressure against my skin. It wasn't the calm, neutral observation I was used to. This was focused. It was an intelligence waiting for me, waiting to see what I would do. I walked into the clearing and stood before the ancient stump. It felt like standing before a judge. I carefully placed the apple in the center, right where my grandfather had found the quartz crystal all those years ago. The air was dead still. I could hear my own heartbeat, a frantic, muffled drum in my ears. I stood there for a long moment, my eyes on the apple, but my senses screaming with the presence all around me. I was showing trust. I was vulnerable. I was asking for guidance in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. I didn't linger. That was part of the rule, part of the trust. You make the offering, and you leave. You trust that it will be received. I turned my back on the stump, on the offering, on the unseen watcher in the trees, and I walked away. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. Every instinct screamed at me to look back, to wait for a sign, an answer. But I just kept walking, my steps even, my breathing controlled. I didn't look back until I was at the edge of my own yard, until the stone wall was at my feet. The clearing was empty. The apple was still there. Or maybe it wasn't. I couldn't be sure from this distance. The pact, which for my entire life had been a source of quiet stability, a secret comfort, now felt like a thread I was holding over a chasm, and I had no idea if it was about to hold, or if it was about to snap. This bond, this fragile piece, it wasn't always just about warnings and mushrooms. It deepened over my lifetime, in a series of quiet, almost imperceptible episodes that went beyond simple reciprocity. One summer, when I was a teenager, I came out to the porch to find 3 smooth, flat river stones arranged in a perfect triangle by the door. It was strange, but I didn't think much of it until I heard the news that afternoon. 3 poachers, who had been illegally trapping on the far side of the valley, had been arrested that very morning, just a mile down the road from my property. 3 stones, 3 poachers. It was a message, a report, a quiet confirmation that the watcher saw threats I didn't, and that our interests were aligned. Another time, years later, after a terrible fight with my wife before she left for good, I sat at the stump in utter despair. I didn't leave an offering. I just sat there, my head in my hands. The next morning, a single, flawless eagle feather was waiting for me. It was a gesture of what? Comfort, empathy. It was a language of symbols, one I am still learning to decipher, and it was becoming more intricate. The truth of the bond, the real depth of it, began to reveal itself in the weeks that followed my desperate question at the stump. The signs became more complex, more personal. It was no longer just a bartering system. One morning, I found a distinct pattern of deep, vertical scratches on the trunk of a massive old-growth cedar that stood near my main access path. They weren't bear claws. The spacing was too wide, too deliberate. It was a mark, a pointer. I'm a forester. I know my trees. But on a hunch, I took my increment borer and tested the core. It was rotten, hollowed out by heart-rot fungus, a widowmaker just waiting for the next big windstorm to fall directly across the only road out. It wasn't just watching me. It was watching the land for me. It was showing me the dangers hidden within the familiar, a partner in stewardship. My father's words echoed, but with new meaning. It watches. Not just my family, but our shared home. This wasn't a beast. This was a sentry. Then it acknowledged Lily again, but with a gentleness that soothed a part of my fear I didn't even know I was holding. She had been playing near the stone wall, building a small house for fairies out of moss and twigs. The next morning, as I walked the property line, I saw it. Just inside the wall, next to the remnants of her little creation, was a perfect, unbroken spiral of snail shells, arranged from largest to smallest, with a single, brilliant blue jay feather placed in the center. It was a piece of art, a found object sculpture left in her space, but not trespassing into it. It was a gesture that spoke volumes. It said, "Asterisk, I see her. She is not a threat. She is part of this place." ***, it felt like a reassurance. A quiet message passed from one guardian to another, acknowledging the most precious thing in my life without ever showing its face. The fear that it had called her name began to transform into a new, more profound and terrifying thought. Maybe it was trying to protect her too. This fragile, evolving piece, this silent dialogue of symbols and shared concerns, was shattered, not by a sound from the woods, but by one from the world beyond it. The property adjacent to mine, 100 acres of undeveloped forest, was sold. The buyer wasn't another local or a logging company. It was, as the realtor cheerfully informed me, a tech executive from Seattle looking for a weekend escape. The first sign of trouble was the noise. Not the honest sound of chainsaws and labor, but the whine of a TV. The thud of music played on outdoor speakers, a constant grating intrusion on the deep, sacred quiet of the valley. They were treating the forest like a playground, a commodity for their leisure, with no understanding of its ancient rhythms or its unwritten rules. They were loud, they were careless, and they were blind to the world they had just entered. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. They were a cancer, and they were right on my border. Then came the drone. I first saw it as a black speck against the grey sky, and I first heard it as a high-pitched insect-like whine that seemed to drill directly into my skull. It was a sound that didn't belong here, a violation of the air itself. Day after day, they would send it up, a mechanical vulture mapping my world. I'd see it hovering over the ridges where I worked, a cold, unblinking eye tracking my movements. It felt like a profound violation, stripping away the privacy that was the very foundation of my life, of my family's pact. The feeling of being watched, which had been a comfort for so long, was now twisted into a cold, electronic paranoia. I found myself looking over my shoulder, not for a familiar shadow in the trees, but for a piece of plastic and circuitry in the sky. It was the modern world, in its most intrusive form, laying siege to my ancient one. The woods felt the intrusion, too. The atmosphere changed. The watcher went silent. My offerings at the stump were still taken. The apple or the carving would be gone by morning, but there were no return gifts. The communication ceased. It was a tense, waiting silence, the kind that comes before a storm. The creature was hiding, pulling back from the electronic eye, and I felt its absence like a physical ache. The balance was broken. The presence of the drone was a constant, low-grade threat. A question mark, hanging over everything. What if it flew over the clearing? What if it recorded something? The thought sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I had become the sole keeper of a secret that was one battery charge away from becoming a global headline. My father had feared the silence that came from a broken rule. I now feared the noise of a secret being exposed to the world. That fear became a reality on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was overcast. The air, heavy and still. I was in my workshop, sharpening a blade, when I heard it. The asterisk thump, dash thump, asterisk. But it wasn't the slow, deliberate warning I knew. It was faster, agitated, a frantic, hammering rhythm that spoke of alarm, of imminent danger. It was the sound of distress. My blood ran cold. I dropped the blade, the clang echoing in the sudden silence of my own held breath, and I burst out of the workshop, my eyes scanning the sky. And there it was, the drone. It wasn't just flying over my property. It was hovering, low and steady, directly over the clearing, directly over the sacred stump. A tiny worry machine, its camera lens pointed down at the very heart of my family's secret. My pact, my entire world. A white-hot panic seized me. This was it. The moment of exposure. My secret, my grandfather's secret, the creature's very existence, was being recorded, digitized, and beamed to a stranger's phone, to be posted, shared, and dissected by a world that would never understand. In that instant, every horror story I'd ever imagined became real. Men with guns and nets, scientists with cages. The quiet woods turned into a circus, a spectacle. The century of my forest, hunted and captured or killed. The thought was so horrific, so visceral, that I couldn't breathe. The sanctity of the place, of the pact, was being violated in the most clinical, detached way imaginable, by a machine that couldn't comprehend the sacrilege it was committing. It was a desecration. My first primal instinct was for the rifle locked in the cabin. The thought of bringing the .306 to my shoulder, of centering that worry pest in my sights and blasting it out of the sky, was overwhelmingly tempting. A single, violent act to end the threat. But my mind, racing faster than my heart, saw the consequences. A gunshot would echo through the valley. The neighbors would come looking for their expensive toy. They'd find it shot to pieces on my land. It wouldn't end the scrutiny. It would be a signed confession. It would bring the sheriff, questions, suspicion. It would be like pouring gasoline on a fire. I couldn't solve a problem of exposure by creating a spectacle. I had to be smarter. I had to be quieter. I had to fight the modern world with its own tools. I turned and sprinted back into the workshop, my boots skidding on the concrete floor. I shoved aside a stack of lumber and wrenched open a dusty metal footlocker in the corner. Inside, nestled in foam, was my own piece of forbidden technology. A high-powered directional signal jammer, a relic from a brief and paranoid phase years ago, when I wanted the power to create a bubble of absolute silence around me, free from cell signals and GPS. I never thought I'd use it for this. I yanked it out, flipped the power switches, and cranked the gain dial all the way to maximum. The small antenna hummed with power. I ran back outside, aimed the device toward the clearing, and held my breath, praying to a god I wasn't sure I believed in. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, the drone's infuriating whine sputtered, changed pitch, and died. It wobbled, then tumbled from the sky, crashing harmlessly into a thicket of blackberry bushes on their side of the property line. Silence returned. But it wasn't the peaceful quiet of the forest. It was the ringing, deafening quiet after an explosion. The air still tasted of ozone and panic. That evening, as I knew he would, the neighbor came to my door. He had that polite, thin smile that city people use when they're furious. He talked about a catastrophic equipment malfunction, about how the drone's logs showed total signal failure in a way the manufacturer had never seen before. He asked, his eyes holding mine, if I knew of any broadcast towers or strange interference in the area. The lie was heavy and sour in my mouth as I shrugged and played the part of the dumb, bewildered local. I just said, nope, not in like that out here. Just trees and quiet. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. He knew I was lying. He just didn't know why. The cost of that afternoon became sickeningly clear in the days that followed. The already cool relationship with my neighbors turned to ice. They stopped waving. I'd catch them watching my cabin through binoculars from their deck. The invisible fence between our properties was now a very real and hostile border. The peace I had so carefully curated, the quiet isolation that protected my secret, was gone. It was replaced by the metallic taste of fear and the low-grade, constant hum of paranoia. I had won the battle, but in doing so, I had invited a war. I had protected the secret from a single electronic eye, but I had drawn the attention of two very suspicious human ones. The secret was no longer contained within the woods. The threat was now at my doorstep, listening and waiting. The creature's response to the incident was the most unsettling part of it all. The offerings at the stump resumed, but their nature changed completely. There were no more chantarelles, no more acts of simple reciprocity. Instead, the items left for me were cryptic and strange. One morning, it was a shard of heavily rusted metal, so old it flaked apart in my hand. A few days later, a piece of brittle, hardened leather that looked like it could have come from the sole of a 19th century boot. And most disturbing of all, the items weren't being left at the stump anymore. They were being placed, deliberately, on the narrow, overgrown trail that led to the old, abandoned quarry on the north side of my property. A place my grandfather had always been adamant we avoid. Nothing for us there, he'd say, with a finality that always stopped my questions. The pattern was unmistakable. This was no longer a simple exchange. This was a summons. The gifts were no longer gifts. They were clues. They were breadcrumbs. The drone incident, the near exposure, had forced a change in its strategy. It was as if the creature, the silent watcher, understood that quiet coexistence was no longer a viable option. The modern world was closing in, and its old methods of communication were too subtle, too slow. It was pushing me, guiding me, urging me toward the one place on this land that held a feeling of deep, old dread. It was pointing me toward the quarry. The central question of my life had shifted. It was no longer a matter of what asterisk it was, but a desperate need to understand what it was trying to show me. The weight of the secret had doubled, and it was now pulling me toward a truth I was terrified to uncover. The emotional turning point, the moment this whole secret stopped being a burden I carried and became a debt I owed, happened during the first big autumn storm of the season. It came on fast, the sky turning a bruised, sickly purple over the ridges, and the wind beginning to howl through the cedars like a grieving animal. I was in a frantic rush, securing the shutters and bringing in the last of the firewood before the deluge hit. Lily had been building a little fairy house by the creek that runs along the edge of our yard. In the chaos of preparing for the storm, of the wind stealing my breath and the first icy drops of rain hitting my face, I lost track of her. It was for no more than 15 minutes. But in these woods, in a storm like this, 15 minutes is a lifetime. When I called her name, and the only answer was the roaring wind. A cold, silent dread washed over me, heavier and more chilling than the rain itself. The world just stopped. The silence that followed my first shout of her name was the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. It was a complete and total void. The wind, the groaning trees, the rain, it all vanished, replaced by the frantic, roaring static in my own head. I screamed her name again, a raw, ragged sound torn from my throat. Nothing. The baseline of sound that had been the soundtrack to my entire life was gone, and in its place was a perfect, predatory vacuum. The woods I knew, the land that was my birthright and my life's work, transformed in an instant. It was no longer my home. It was a labyrinth of shadows and rain, a hostile, alien place that had swallowed my daughter whole. My expertise, my knowledge of every trail and tree, it all meant nothing. I was just a terrified father, completely and utterly powerless, alone in a suddenly monstrous world. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat a sickening reminder of another second she was gone. I ran. I don't remember making a choice. My body just took over. I plunged into the woods, the rain plastering my hair to my skull, the branches whipping my face like cutting wires. I yelled her name until my voice was a shredded whisper, the sound consumed by the storm's fury. Every shadow looked like a predator. Every rustle of leaves was a new wave of terror. I followed the creek, my boots sinking into the mud, my mind a whirlwind of horrific possibilities. A fall into the churning water, a twisted ankle in the dark, a cougar drawn out by the storm. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs were numb, pushed forward only by pure, blind panic. An hour passed, then another. The last light was fading from the sky, and a despair so profound it felt like a physical death began to settle in my bones. I was going to lose her. I was going to lose her out here, in the dark. I found her, but not because of my skill as a tracker. I stumbled into a part of the forest I barely recognized, 2 miles north of the cabin, where the land falls away into a rocky ravine, and I saw her, huddled, but impossibly, completely dry, tucked under a deep rock overhang I had never seen before in my life. The relief was so immense, so total, it buckled my knees. I fell to the ground in front of her, the mud and wet leaves cold against my skin, and I couldn't speak. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide, but she was calm, looking at me as if I was the one who was lost. I crawled forward and pulled her into my arms, burying my face in her small shoulder. The scent of her hair of rain and earth and innocent childhood was the only real thing in the entire world. The storm still raged around us, but in that small pocket of stone, there was only a profound, impossible stillness. I held her for a long time, just rocking back and forth, my own trembling finally starting to subside. When I could finally speak, I asked her how she got here, how she stayed so dry. She looked past me, back toward the dark wall of trees, and her voice was a small, quiet whisper. She said when the rain got bad, she got scared and started to run back to the cabin, but she tripped and fell. She said a tall, quiet man made of tree bark had found her. He hadn't spoken, she said. He just stood over her for a moment, shielding her from the wind and rain with his own massive body, and then he gently nudged her with a huge, dark hand, guiding her toward the rock overhang. He had led her to shelter. He had saved her life. As she spoke, the image of it, this enormous mythical creature, acting as a gentle shield for my tiny daughter, imprinted itself on my soul, and that's when I saw it. As I held her, my gaze fell to the ground beside her, to a small object lying on the dusty floor of the shelter. It was a bird, crudely carved from a piece of dark wood, its wings outstretched. My breath caught in my throat. It was a clumsy, amateurish carving, something a child might make, or something my grandfather might make. It was identical, down to the nick on the left wing where the knife had slipped, to a small wooden bird my own grandfather had carved for me when I was her age. A totem I had carried in my pocket every day until I lost it, somewhere in these very woods, more than 30 years ago. My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a similar bird. It was Asterisk, the asterisk bird. He had found it, he had kept it, and now, at this moment, he had returned it. The whole world tilted on its axis. This being, this creature, this shadow that had lived on the periphery of my family's life for 3 generations, wasn't just a silent neighbor. It wasn't just a force of nature we had a pact with, it was a witness. It had been watching me, personally, since I was a boy. It had seen me lose a treasured object. And it had understood its sentimental value enough to keep it, to preserve it for 3 decades, and to return it to me now, at the moment of my greatest desperation, as a symbol. A symbol of what? That he knew me. That he was returning my lost child, just as he was returning my lost childhood relic. The gesture was so profound, so deeply and impossibly personal, that the last walls of my fear and uncertainty about its nature crumbled into dust. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a myth. It was a guardian. As I was reeling from this, trying to process the impossible fact of the wooden bird in my hand, Lily's small voice cut through my thoughts. She must have seen the strange look on my face. She added one more detail, something she must have forgotten in her initial story. His leg was sore. Daddy, she said, her voice full of a child's simple empathy. The bark man, she said. He walked with a funny hop. She mimicked a slight limp, and he kept looking back. She turned and pointed a small finger. Not randomly into the woods, but with a specific, deliberate aim. She was pointing north. He kept pointing that way. She whispered, over there. Before he went away, her finger was aimed directly toward the overgrown, shadowed ridgeline that concealed the old, abandoned quarry. The place my grandfather had forbidden us from ever going near. The clues clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. The rusted metal shard, the piece of ancient leather, the cryptic objects left on the path, leading me, pulling me. And now this, the rescue of my daughter, the return of my childhood totem, and the final, unmistakable direction. He had a sore leg. He was pointing toward the quarry. He wasn't just leaving breadcrumbs anymore. He had saved my daughter's life as a way to get my absolute, undivided attention. He had paid a price I could never repay, creating a debt so massive that I could not, in good conscience, ignore his summons any longer. The whole narrative had been rewritten. This wasn't about a mysterious creature hiding in the woods. This was about a creature trying desperately, for reasons I couldn't fathom, to tell me something. Something that was hidden in the quarry. The weight of the secret shifted in that moment. It was no longer the cold, fearful burden of keeping a monster hidden from the world. It transformed into the heavy, solemn responsibility of a debt. A life debt. He had protected the most important person in my world, and in doing so, he had placed his trust in me. He trusted me to understand his language of symbols, to follow his clues, and to finally uncover the truth he had been trying to show me. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, driving sense of purpose. I owed him. I owed him more than apples and carved animals. I owed him my attention. I owed him an answer to his silent, desperate call. The pact was no longer about coexistence. It had become an alliance. I carried Lily all the way back to the cabin, the little wooden bird clutched tightly in my fist. She was asleep before we even reached the porch. As I laid her in her bed, I looked from her peaceful, innocent face to the dark, rain-lashed window, toward the northern ridge. My choice was made. The old rules were broken. The fear of what I might find in that quarry was immense, but the fear of betraying the trust of the being that saved my daughter was far greater. I had to go. I had to know. If you've been listening this far, if you feel the weight of this debt that I now carry, please, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who understands that some debts can't be ignored. You need to stay with me until the end, because what I did next, what I found in that quarry, it changed everything. Not just for me, but for the memory of my entire family. The drone incident had consequences that rippled out far beyond my property line. The neighbor, convinced of some unfriendly activity on my part after his expensive toy's inexplicable malfunction, did more than just watch my cabin through binoculars. He also reported the strange, deep-throated vocalizations he had managed to record before his drone went down. He sent them to the biology department at the state university, framing it as a concerned citizen's report on potential undocumented wildlife. He thought he was just being a nuisance. A clever way to get back at me. He had no idea that he was firing a flare into the sky, a signal that would bring an entirely different kind of observer into my quiet world. A week passed in tense silence. The woods were holding their breath, and so was I. The watcher was silent, and the neighbors were hostile. I felt like I was living on a knife's edge, caught between two worlds, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the blade was about to fall. The peace was over. The siege had begun. He arrived on a Thursday morning, his sensible sedan kicking up dust on the gravel road. His name was Dr. Aris Thorne, a man whose polite demeanor did nothing to soften the unnerving intensity in his eyes. He introduced himself as a biology professor with a quiet side interest in unclassified species, specifically tracking a rare displaced owl species whose migration patterns had been disrupted. He spoke of acoustic signatures and ecological niches, his language calm, rational, and utterly disarming. Then he made the request that made the blood freeze in my veins. He asked for permission to place a few harmless acoustic sensors and motion-activated camera traps on my property. He said, my land, with its old-growth stands and lack of human traffic, was the perfect final candidate for his study. He was the authority I had always feared, cloaked not in a uniform, but in the patient, methodical language of science. To say no would be to paint a giant flashing target on my back. To say yes felt like a profound and unforgivable betrayal. The word yes was the heaviest thing I'd ever lifted. It felt like a stone in my mouth. A betrayal not just of the creature, but of my father, my grandfather, and the 70 years of silent trust they had built. But what choice did I have? Refusing access to a scientist looking for an endangered owl would have been the most suspicious thing I could possibly do. It would have turned his professional curiosity into a personal obsession. So I nodded, my face a mask of reluctant cooperation. I signed his liability waiver, the pen scratching on the paper sounding like a final verdict. The moment he walked away, a new kind of silence descended on the property, a paranoia so thick it was suffocating. Every shadow now seemed to hold a lens. Every snap of a twig felt like a shutter closing. I had willingly invited the enemy inside the gates. I had given him the keys to the kingdom, and I knew, deep in my gut, that he would use them to methodically dismantle the secret I was sworn to protect. The guilt was immediate and absolute. The next day, I saw them. Thorne's team, 2 graduate students who moved with a quiet, efficient discretion that was far more unnerving than any overt intrusion. I'd catch glimpses of them at the edges of my property, moving along the tree lines like ghosts in khaki vests. They never approached the cabin, never made their presence known directly, but I knew they were there. Their GPS trackers were methodically mapping my world, dividing it into grids and data points. The forest, my home, was being transformed into a sterile laboratory. They moved with a purpose that chilled me, their movements precise and economical. It wasn't the rambling exploration of hikers. It was a search pattern. They were sweeping the area, leaving a network of unseen eyes and ears in their wake. My sanctuary was being wired for sound, its most private moments prepared for observation by strangers who saw it not as a living entity, but as a collection of potential evidence. My land felt alien to me for the first time in my life. I found one of the devices by accident. It was strapped to an old order, painted in a mottled camouflage pattern that made it nearly invisible against the bark. A small black box with a delicate microphone, protected by a wire Meshan acoustic sensor. A few yards away, mounted on another tree, was its partner, a camera trap, its dark lens, like a single dead eye, staring blankly at a game trail. The trail that led towards the northern ridge. The trail that led towards the quarry. My heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't just passive observation. This was a trap. Every sound the forest made the groan of a tree, the call of an animal, the deep, resonant asterisk thump asterisk of a warning, would be recorded, catalogued, and analyzed. Every shadow that passed, every flicker of movement, would be captured. The very language of the woods, the subtle communication I had spent a lifetime learning to understand, was being intercepted and translated into cold, hard data, The watcher's voice was being wiretapped. The pact was effectively paralyzed. My routine, the simple act of walking to the stump with an offering, was now fraught with unbearable risk. Was there a camera on the clearing? An acoustic sensor hidden in the ferns? I couldn't risk it. The offerings stopped. I couldn't communicate. I couldn't ask my question. I couldn't even offer the simple gesture of respect that formed the foundation of our truce. The silence from the watcher returned, but this was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the accusatory silence my father had earned. It was an enforced silence, a quarantine imposed by human technology. I felt its absence keenly, a gaping hole in the fabric of my world. Was it still there, hiding in the deepest parts of the woods, confused and angered by my sudden abandonment of the ritual? Or had it fled, driven away by the constant, invisible presence of the electronic intruders? I felt like a jailer in my own home, cutting off the one line of communication that mattered most, all while pretending to be a helpful landowner. The urgency became a physical thing, a constant pressure behind my eyes. I felt trapped, a pawn in a game I couldn't see. The debt to the creature for saving Lily Ward, with the primal need to protect him from Thorn's closing net. My promise to go to the quarry, to understand his message, felt more distant than ever. I started taking long, circuitous routes through the woods, trying to map their grid, trying to find a blind spot. One evening, near dusk, I was skirting the overgrown path to the quarry, when a tiny infrared light blinked once in the shadows just off the trail. A sensor. Activating in the low light, it was less than 50 yards from the trail's beginning. They were already here. They were on the doorstep of the secret. My blood ran cold. I wasn't just being watched, I was being herded. My movements, my avoidance of certain areas, it was all data to Thorn. The paranoia wasn't just in my head anymore. It was a quantifiable, strategic reality. Time was no longer a luxury I could afford. That's when I finally understood the terrifying brilliance of Dr. Thorn's method. He wasn't just looking for an owl. He was methodically eliminating possibilities. In our initial conversation, he had mentioned testing other similar habitats in the region, all with negative results. He was using a process of elimination, and my land was his last, best candidate for something much, much bigger than a bird. The owl story wasn't just a cover. It was a perfect scientific pretext. It gave him legal and ethical justification to deploy the exact kind of equipment needed to detect a large, intelligent, and elusive terrestrial creature. He wasn't a crackpot enthusiast with a theory. He was a serious scientist following a logical chain of evidence, and that chain was leading him, link by undeniable link, directly to the truth. My father's old voice echoed in my head. A phrase I hadn't thought of in years, a cynical joke he'd make about outsiders, a debt to the land. Thorn believed he was owed an answer, and he was taking it. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became a battleground of whispered voices and half-seen shadows. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I could hear the faint electronic hum of a sensor from outside my window. During the day, I second-guessed every step, every decision. The simple act of chopping wood felt like a performance for an unseen audience. Was my posture normal? Did I look nervous? The isolation was absolute. I couldn't talk to anyone. I was the sole warden of an impossible secret. Now under siege by an adversary I couldn't fight, who didn't even know I was his adversary. The guilt of my compliance ate at me. I had betrayed the Watcher's trust by letting them in, and now I was betraying Lily by living a lie. My distraction and fear, a constant, tense presence in our home. I felt myself coming apart at the seams, caught in a moral vice grip, squeezed between the ancient debt I owed to the creature and the modern. Relentless pressure of a man who would not stop until he had his proof, his discovery, his prize. Thorn stopped by again, a week after his team had finished. It was a courtesy visit, he said, just to give me an update. He spoke of inconclusive but fascinating acoustic anomalies, deep frequency sounds that defied easy classification. He mentioned that his grid seemed to show a consistent avoidance pattern, a dead zone of activity concentrated on the north side of the property. He looked me right in the eye as he said it, a cool, calculating gaze. The north side, the quarry, the final piece of the puzzle. I realized then that his net wasn't just closing, it was complete. His logic, his data, his methodical process, it was all pointing him to the one place I couldn't let him go. Time had run out. I couldn't wait for a blind spot. I couldn't hope he would just give up. I had to break my own rules. I had to go to the quarry. Now, tonight, under the cover of darkness, I had to get to the heart of the secret before he did, even if it meant walking directly into his web of sensors. The choice was no longer between action and inaction. It was a race. Torn between protecting Lily, honoring my pact, and Thorn's closing net, I finally broke my own rule. I went to the quarry that night. The moon was just a sliver, a curved knife in the black sky, offering just enough light to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. Every step was a calculation. I knew his sensors were out there, a silent, invisible web, and I was a fly walking willingly into it. I moved slowly, using the sounds of the wind to cover the crunch of my boots on the gravelly path. Lily's words echoed in my mind. A frantic loop. Asterisk, the Barkman. He kept pointing that way. Asterisk, the air grew colder as I approached the sheer rock face of the abandoned quarry. The place my grandfather said held nothing for us. The dread was a physical presence here, a cold weight on my chest. It felt like walking toward my own grave. A place where a truth I did not want to know was patiently waiting to be unearthed. My flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the darkness, and I prayed I was wrong. There, behind a thick, suffocating curtain of overgrown ivy that clung to the rock face, I found it. A dark opening, no bigger than a doorway, that I had never known existed. The air that breathed out of it was stale and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else. Something like ancient regret. I squeezed through the opening, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. It fell upon the truth, and my breath caught in a painful, silent gasp. This was not a nest. It wasn't a den. It was a tomb. The scattered, brittle remains of two human skeletons lay on the cave floor, their bones jumbled together by time and small animals. Beside them, almost completely consumed by rust, were two 19th century pickaxes and a small, heavy, lined box, its surface tarnished to a dead, lusterless grey. My mind reeled, trying to connect this grim tableau to the silent watcher of my woods. This wasn't his story. This was a human story. A story of violence and greed. Just as that thought solidified, a huge shadow fell over me, blotting out the sliver of moonlight from the cave entrance. I spun around, my heart seizing in my chest. He was there. The Bigfoot. He stood framed in the opening, a silhouette of impossible size and stillness. He wasn't aggressive. There was no roar, no threat. He just stood there, a silent, colossal witness. The beam of my flashlight found his eyes, and what I saw in them wasn't animalistic fury, but a deep, ancient, and profoundly weary sadness. He didn't make a sound. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, raised a long arm and pointed one finger at the scattered skeletons on the floor. Then, just as slowly, he pointed to his own right leg, the one Lily had said was sore, which he favored with a slight, almost imperceptible limp. The gesture was unmistakable, a connection, an inheritance of injury or of memory. This was not a random place. It was the center of his world and of his pain. Then he did something that shattered my understanding of everything. He lowered his arm and, in the cramped space of the cave, he mimicked the motion of swinging a pickaxe, a slow, powerful arc through the air. He did it twice, then he stopped, and from deep within his chest came a low, guttural rumble, a sound that wasn't a vocalization, but an imitation. It was the sound of shifting earth, of rocks grinding, of a collapse. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My family's story, the one of the hardy pioneer great-great-grandfather who tamed this land, was a lie. He didn't found this homestead alone. He'd had two partners. These were his partners. He'd murdered them, right here, for whatever was in that light-lined box. He buried them, faked a mine collapse, and built his legacy on their graves. And the creature's ancestor, maybe injured in the chaos, was the only witness. This wasn't a guardian of my family. It was a warden of their crime. In the crushing silence that followed my realization, A tiny, hostile red light blinked on in the woods outside the cave, one of Thorn's motion sensors. He was coming. The data had led him here, to the epicenter of the anomaly. The creature saw the light, too. It turned its massive head and looked at me, its dark eyes holding mine. The deep, weary sadness was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. A question. It had shown me the truth. It had passed the burden of knowledge to me. What was I going to do with it? In that one, silent, shared glance, the 70-year pact was rewritten. This was no longer about offerings and boundaries. This was about justice. The legacy of my family, my name, my entire history, on one side. And on the other, the silent, eternal vigil of this creature, the keeper of a truth too heavy for the earth to hold any longer. In that instant, I chose. I would not let them turn this warden into a specimen. I would not let them unearth one crime only to commit another. I knelt down, my hand shaking, and picked up a single yellowed femur from the scattered bones. It was heavy, real. It was the evidence of my family's sin. I stood up and walked, toward the cave entrance, toward the creature. For a heart-stopping moment, we were face to face, the smell of damp fur and ancient earth filling my senses. It did not move. It simply watched me, its gaze holding a universe of unspoken history. I stepped past it, out of the tomb and into the night, the bone clutched in my hand like a terrible trophy. I walked out to meet Thorn. He was standing 20 yards away, his face illuminated by the glow of a tablet, his expression a mixture of triumph and confusion. The signals all converged here, he said, his voice a low, excited whisper. What did you find? I held up the bone. The lie came easily, a necessary poison. I think you were right about this place being special, I said, my voice steady. It looks like I found an old pioneer grave, probably from that documented mining accident back in 1890. Thorn's eyes locked onto the bone. The biologist in him was instantly eclipsed by the historian, the discoverer. The pursuit of a living myth was abstract, fantastical. But this, a human bone, a piece of verifiable history, this was real. This was a paper, a discovery. I had given him a different prize, but a prize nonetheless. I sacrificed my family's pristine legacy, turning them from heroic founders into victims of a common tragedy. To lead him away from the cave, away from the creature, away from the whole monstrous truth. I sold out my ancestors to save their silent accuser. He took the bone, his fingers tracing its length with a kind of reverence. He had his proof, just not the proof he was looking for. The search for Bigfoot was over. The archaeological dig was about to begin. The creature, hidden in the shadows of the cave, was safe. The pact was honored. The debt was paid. But the silence it left behind was the heaviest of all. The final soul-crushing twist came a week later. Thorn and his university team were gone, replaced by a new team of archaeologists roping off the area. The lie had worked. The woods were quiet again. One evening, I was sitting in my workshop, the small, crudely carved wooden bird resting in the palm of my hand. My grandfather's gift, returned by a ghost. I had been so overwhelmed by the moment, I hadn't truly examined it. Running my thumb over the surface, I realized the wood felt wrong. It was too hard, too dense. It wasn't fir or cedar. It wasn't from any tree on my land. I looked closer, at the grain, at the weight of it. It was ancient, petrified hickory. My blood ran cold. Petrified hickory, the kind used for tool handles in the 19th century because of its legendary strength. It wasn't carved from a random branch. It was carved from the handle of one of the murderer's pickaxes. The murder weapon. He hadn't just been guarding a grave. He had been trying to give us the evidence, the whole story, for over a century. My father's rule, some things aren't for us to know, was wrong. He had been trying to make us know. The offerings, the symbols, the warnings, it was all a desperate, generations-long attempt to communicate an injustice, to give us the means to bring the truth to light. The quartz crystal wasn't a thank you. It was a clue, found in the mine. The eagle feather wasn't empathy. It was a sign of a witness from above. And the rescue of Lily wasn't just a trade. It was a final, desperate plea, an act of profound trust to force me to finally listen. He watches, yes. But he wasn't watching over us. He was watching us, waiting for one of us, for one generation, to finally be worthy of understanding the truth he was burdened to carry. He was waiting for a generation that would choose justice over the comfort of a lie. The weight of that realization was heavier than any secret. It was the weight of a duty I had unknowingly inherited. My final choice is to live with this knowledge. I will not disturb the box. I will not expose the full truth. Thorne's version of the story will become history, and my family's name will be forever tied to a tragic accident instead of a monstrous crime. That is my sacrifice. The ritual at the stump has resumed, but it is different now. I no longer leave offerings of respect to a spirit of the forest. I leave offerings of solidarity, of conspiracy. I am the human warden, and he is the ancient one. We are partners in a silent, eternal vigil, guarding a truth that the land itself has chosen to keep. The moral here isn't about man versus beast. It's about how the land holds the truths we try to bury, and how some debts are not paid in coin or confession, but in shared silence. The secret is heavier now, but I do not carry it alone. In the deepest parts of the forest, a silent watcher stands his post, and for the first time, I think he knows he is finally seen. Thank you for listening to my confession. The weight is not gone, but sharing it has made it possible to carry. If this story has stayed with you, if you've felt even a fraction of the weight I've carried, please show your support by leaving a like, subscribing to the channel for more stories from the edge of our mapped world, and sharing this with someone who will understand. And please, stick around for the next video that will appear on your screen. There are more secrets out there, waiting in the silence, and more voices that need to be heard. Thank you.